Picture this. An 86-year-old man sits in a wheelchair in a dim English country house, and on his lap rests a leather-bound journal that has not been opened in front of another human being for 3 decades. His name is Andrew Parker Bowles. He is a retired brigadier of the Blues and Royals, a former silver stick-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth II, a decorated veteran of Northern Ireland and Rhodesia, and the first husband of Queen Camilla. And the reason he is finally, at the end of his life, allowing certain people to glimpse the contents of that journal has almost nothing to do with the story you were told in 1995. Nothing at all. Because here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. For 30 years, the narrative has been spotless, scrubbed clean. A retired army officer steps aside gracefully so his wife can be with the future king. He is the understanding ex-husband, the man who knew his place, the fellow who conveniently vanished from the frame so the great royal love story between Charles and Camilla could proceed without a messy human triangle spoiling the picture. And that version of events is a lie. Not a small lie, not an exaggeration, not a matter of perspective. It is a carefully engineered institutional fiction, constructed by palace courtiers, enforced by lawyers, and maintained by the silence of a man who was given a choice that was never really a choice at all. What you are about to hear is the documented sequence of events that proves Andrew Parker Bowles did not walk away from his marriage. He was pushed out by a multi-billion-pound institution that treated his personal dignity as a line item on a risk assessment spreadsheet. And by the end of this, you will know exactly what was in that leather-bound journal, why the palace spent decades making sure it stayed shut, and what one quiet moment at a horse show in 1991 revealed about the entire machinery of the British crown. But I am saving that moment for last, because once you hear it, everything else clicks into place like the tumblers of a lock. Let me set the scene properly, because the timeline alone dismantles the official version of events. January 1995. Andrew Parker Bowles is sitting in a London law office. He is not alone. The room is crowded with high-ranking palace courtiers and legal advisors, the kind of people who never appear in public but whose signatures appear on documents that reshape lives. On the polished table in front of him sit divorce papers. Attached to those papers is a standard non-disclosure clause, a legal instrument that will muzzle him permanently for the rest of his natural life. Now, the public story at this point had already been written. The previous year, in June of 1994, Prince Charles had appeared on national television and confessed to adultery in front of millions of British households. That broadcast, orchestrated by the Palace Press Office, had turned Andrew Parker Bowles into the most publicly humiliated husband in the country. Every newspaper in Britain ran the same angle. Poor old Andrew, cuckolded by the Prince of Wales. The assumption everyone made, from tabloid editors to his fellow officers, was that he was simply clearing the path, perhaps receiving a quiet financial handshake from the Duchy of Cornwall, a comfortable pension, a dignified exit. But the internal records from that period paint a picture that is entirely, disturbingly different. The pressure on Andrew Parker Bowles was not subtle. It was not dressed up in politeness or wrapped in appeals to patriotism. The courtiers went straight for the two things he actually cared about: his military loyalty and his children, Tom and Laura. They laid out a prediction for him, although calling it a prediction is generous. It was a roadmap, a detailed, clinical description of exactly what would happen if he refused to cooperate. They told him that if he fought the divorce, if he exposed the true timeline of the relationship between Charles and Camilla, the legal discovery process would drag the entire royal family through the courts. Depositions, financial audits of the Duchy of Cornwall, testimony under oath, the line of succession itself would be called into question. And Andrew Parker Bowles, who had spent his entire adult life serving the crown, who had held the ceremonial position of silver stick-in-waiting, who had literally stood guard over the monarch during state occasions, understood exactly what was being asked of him. He signed the papers. He agreed, in that room, to become the villain of his own story, the man who could not keep his wife, the complacent husband who looked the other way while the Prince of Wales conducted an affair under his roof, the pushover who just let it all happen, and what followed was a daily humiliation so grinding, so relentless, that most people would have cracked within a month. He could not defend himself to his fellow officers. He could not explain the truth to his closest friends. He had to walk through London with photographers tracking his every movement, smiling politely while newspaper headlines called him a failure and a fool. There is a specific detail from a regimental dinner in November of 1997 that captures the full weight of what this silence cost him. Fellow officers at the dinner actually avoided his table. They did not know whether to offer condolences or simply look away. Andrew Parker Bowles sat there in full military posture, back straight, chin up, and did not offer a single word of defense. Not one. Buckingham Palace got exactly what it wanted: a clean, quiet separation. The public focus landed on a failing marriage instead of an institutional crisis. But the cost of that silence, the real, human, grinding cost of walking away with nothing and saying nothing for decades, that is what fills the pages of the leather-bound journal. And here is where the financial dimension of this story gets genuinely shocking, because it demolishes one of the most persistent rumors in modern royal history. Everyone assumed Andrew Parker Bowles received a massive payoff. The newspapers hinted at settlements worth millions of pounds. The word around London was that Charles had drained a portion of his Duchy of Cornwall reserves to purchase Andrew's compliance. It made perfect sense on the surface. Why else would a man with legal standing, military rank, and documented evidence of his wife's affair simply vanish without a fight? But the land registry records from the spring of 1995 tell a completely different story. Andrew Parker Bowles did not receive a single penny from Charles. Not one. He actually refused the standard financial packages that the palace legal team offered him. He walked away with nothing but his standard military pension, the same pension any retired brigadier would receive. Let that sit for a moment. Middlewick House, the grand Wiltshire estate where he and Camilla had lived, had to be sold just to cover the existing mortgages and outstanding debts that had accumulated during the final chaotic years of the marriage. Andrew Parker Bowles wanted his children, Tom and Laura, to look back at the divorce records someday and see that their father had not sold their mother to the future King of England. That was the principle. He stripped himself of financial security to prevent his family name from looking like a business transaction. But the emptiness of his bank account reveals something much deeper that was happening in the shadows behind the official paperwork. Because while Charles was not directly paying Andrew off, there was a powerful figure moving through this entire situation like a ghost. Lord Goodman. If that name does not ring a bell, it should. Arnold Goodman was a legendary and genuinely feared legal fixer in London, a man whose very presence in a room meant that something very large and very sensitive was being managed. And Lord Goodman had been quietly visiting the Wiltshire area under a false name since late 1994. He was not representing the Prince of Wales. He was not working for Queen Elizabeth II. Goodman was operating on behalf of a secretive committee of senior politicians and crown advisors who had analyzed the monarchy's financial exposure and reached a conclusion that genuinely terrified them. Here's what terrified them. If Andrew Parker Bowles contested the divorce on grounds of long-term infidelity by Charles, the court would be legally required to demand a full audit of the Duchy of Cornwall's private accounts to determine the prince's true net worth. That audit would have exposed the sheer scale of the royal family's hidden wealth at a time when the British public was suffering through an economic recession. It would have shown exactly how much money was flowing from tenant farmers on duchy land into the prince's private coffers while ordinary citizens struggled to pay their taxes. Lord Goodman made it explicit. A public trial would trigger a constitutional crisis. The monarchy could lose its sovereign grant entirely. Parliament might vote to strip the crown of its financial privileges. So Andrew Parker Bowles was presented with a choice that was no choice at all. Stay silent, accept the blame, live off a modest army stipend, or fight for a fair settlement and risk destroying the very institution he had sworn an oath to protect. He chose the army pension. He watched the removal lorry drive out through the gates of Middlewick House, knowing he had protected the crown's billions while sacrificing his own financial future. The files were closed, the The house was sold. The public swallowed the myth of the golden handshake. Palace officials ticked his name off their risk assessment logs and assumed the financial threat had been dealt with. But money was only the first layer of their anxiety. A far more dangerous problem was developing, and it was entirely of their own making. Think about it from a strategic perspective. A military man with no assets and a broken home has nothing left to lose. And the people Andrew called the Gray Men, that is what he named the palace operatives who managed the crown's reputation, those Gray Men knew he still held his official military clearance, his personal diaries, and his deep connections within British intelligence services. They had successfully starved him out of his family estate, but they had accidentally created an independent operator who knew the physical layout of every royal residence in the country. By the summer of 1995, Andrew Parker Bowles had moved into a small rented flat in London. His uniform was still immaculate. His daily routine had changed completely. He started spending his afternoons in the library of the United, Oxford, and Cambridge University Club, filling small blue notebooks with detailed timelines. He was tracking specific dates when royal protection officers had been reassigned from his own security detail to cover the prince's private visits to Camilla. He was building a defense file, not for a courtroom, for his own survival. The palace security apparatus noticed his movements immediately. They realized that taking away Middlewick House had not broken his spirit. It had simply removed him from their direct line of sight. A penniless brigadier with a grievance was a direct threat to the upcoming public relations campaign designed to rehabilitate Camilla's image in the eyes of the British public. So, in August of 1995, Andrew Parker Bowles received a private letter at his club from a palace intermediary. The document offered a guaranteed future for his children. It matched Tom's entry into the publishing world and Laura's budding art career against Andrew's continued silence. The shadow that had been hanging over his property shifted directly to his bloodline, forcing a final choice between personal justice and his children's professional success. Now, here is where I need to take you backward in time, because the most revealing moment in this entire story did not happen in a law office or a courtier's meeting room. It happened in the rain, at a horse show, 4 years before the divorce papers were even drafted. And this is the part most people get completely wrong. May of 1991. The badminton horse trials. Rain is hammering against the canvas of the hospitality tent. Inside, the air is thick with wet wool and damp earth and expensive champagne. The usual country set scene. Andrew Parker Bowles is standing near the back exit, scanning the crowd of aristocrats and military officials when a sudden hush rolls through the tent like a wave. Princess Diana has entered. She is flanked by 2 protection officers. She does not stop to speak with the event organizers. She does not work the room. She walks directly, with purpose, toward the corner where Andrew stands alone. The press corps is trapped behind the barriers outside, their telephoto lenses blurred and useless in the heavy downpour. For 3 minutes, the most photographed woman in the world stands inches from the husband of her husband's mistress. Diana does not shout. She does not cry. She leans toward him and whispers a single sentence that rewrites how he understands his entire existence. She tells him that they are both being treated as operational variables by the same Gray Men at Buckingham Palace. She warns him that his telephones are being tapped by the security services, not to catch him in a scandal, but to monitor how much he knows about the private movements of Charles and Camilla. Diana looks him dead in the eyes and tells him that the palace has already decided their marriages are collateral damage. The machinery of the state is already drafting the blueprints for a new court, one that requires the absolute elimination of both Diana and Andrew from the royal equation. Most people would hear something like that and either dismiss it as paranoia or immediately run to a journalist. Andrew Parker Bowles did neither. He returned to his quarters at the Household Cavalry Barracks in London that evening and used his military clearance to initiate a discreet investigation into the security protocols surrounding his official residence. Within 48 hours, an intelligence contact confirmed everything Diana had warned him about. A surveillance device had been planted inside the telephone junction box on the exterior wall of his Wiltshire home. The line was active, Every conversation he had with his children, every military directive he issued to his officers, every argument he had with Camilla about the state of their marriage, all of it was being recorded and transcribed for a committee operating out of the cabinet office. The realization shattered something fundamental inside Andrew Parker Bowles. He had spent his entire adult life defending the realm. He had survived active combat zones in Northern Ireland. He had served through dangerous colonial assignments. He believed in the chain of command. He believed in the honor of the regiment. He believed in the sanctity of his oath to the Queen. To discover that the state apparatus he had served with his body and his career was treating him like an enemy combatant, that was a betrayal that cut deeper than his wife's infidelity ever could. He was not fighting a personal battle against a romantic rival. He was locked inside a cage with a multi-billion-pound corporate entity that viewed his personal dignity as a threat to its global brand. And then came the confrontation that nearly brought the whole thing crashing down. July of 1992, a private polo match at Cirencester Park. Charles is playing for the home team. Andrew Parker Bowles is officiating from the royal box. After the final whistle, away from the spectators and the cameras, Andrew intercepts Charles in the changing rooms. The confrontation is brief, clinical. He does not mention Camilla's name. He does not demand an apology for the public humiliation of his family. Instead, he drops a handwritten list of surveillance dates onto the wooden bench next to the prince's polo equipment. He looks at the future king and delivers an ultimatum. He demands that the state surveillance on his home cease immediately, or he will use his upcoming retirement speech at the United Service Institution to reveal the espionage to the international press. Charles turns pale. He does not deny the surveillance. He does not defend the palace advisors. He tells Andrew that he has no control over the security services and their actions regarding constitutional protection. The prince leaves the room without picking up the paper. But 48 hours later, the surveillance device vanishes from the wall in Wiltshire as quietly as it had appeared. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Andrew Parker Bowles knew his victory was temporary. The palace now viewed him as a dangerous wild card. A highly trained military strategist who possessed hard evidence of state-sponsored espionage against a British citizen. The Grey Men would not forget, and they would not forgive. On June the 29th, 1994, Andrew sat in his armchair and watched Charles confess his adultery to millions of homes on national television. The palace press office had carefully engineered the broadcast schedule months in advance to force Andrew's hand. By making the infidelity a matter of public record, the state stripped Andrew of his ability to maintain his marriage without appearing completely complicit. The public focus was funneled into a sordid love triangle, ensuring nobody looked closer at the intelligence files or the classified documents locked inside his desk. Andrew Parker Bowles looked at the screen and understood the true architecture of the trap. If he stayed in the marriage, he was a laughingstock. If he fought, he was a traitor. Buckingham Palace had used the media to achieve what they could not achieve through intimidation. They had isolated him from his peers, neutralized his military standing, and prepared the public for the inevitable final act. A few weeks later, the physical proof of this manipulation arrived at his London club in a plain brown envelope. Inside was an unredacted copy of the broadcasting schedule for that financial quarter, alongside internal memoranda from the palace press office dated 6 months before the televised interview. The documents proved the entire television event was a long-planned institutional realignment, not a spontaneous moment of honesty from the prince. Andrew Parker Bowles realized the palace had been engineering his exit while he was still wearing the uniform of the Queen. He packed the scheduling documents into a small leather briefcase alongside his private logs. He knew that any direct retaliation would instantly trigger a court-martial under the Official Secrets Act. The state had covered its tracks using national security laws as a shield, but the briefcase contained one final anomaly the palace advisors had overlooked: a receipt for a private courier service that had delivered a package from the cabinet office to Camilla's address on the night before Diana's warning at the badminton horse trials. Andrew locked the case. The betrayal was not just a historical event, it was an ongoing operation. And now we come to the part of this story that genuinely made me stop and stare at my notes for a full 10 minutes. Because this is where the institution reached into the past and weaponized a national tragedy to break a man's will. The Hyde Park bombing, July the 20th, 1982. Shrapnel and shattered glass litter the tarmac of South Carriage Drive. Smoke rises from the remains of a household cavalry escort vehicle. The air reeks of gunpowder and burning metal. 4 soldiers and 7 horses from the Blues and Royals lie dead after an Irish Republican Army nail bomb tears through the routine changing of the guard ceremony. Andrew Parker Bowles, then a commanding officer, arrives at the scene within 4 minutes of the detonation. His uniform is splattered with blood as he pulls surviving troopers from the wreckage and coordinates the emergency military response. The public hails him as a rock during the regiment's darkest hour. Newspapers print photographs of him standing amid the carnage, steady as iron. But the files generated by that specific tragedy became the weapon the palace used against him more than a decade later. The hard documentation from the bombing investigation was compiled into a thick blue government folder labeled Operation Ironclad. For 20 years, those papers sat in a secure basement at the Ministry of Defense under a 40-year secrecy classification. The official report detailed the security lapses that allowed the terrorist cell to track the exact route of the cavalry horses through central London. In 1993, as the marital crisis between Charles and Camilla reached its most dangerous phase, a duplicate copy of that folder arrived on the desk of Sir Michael Peet, the financial architect behind the royal family's restructuring operations. The palace was not studying the files for military history. They were hunting for a vulnerability that could compel an honorable officer to comply. The pressure crystallized during a meeting at the Cavalry and Guards Club on Piccadilly in October of 1993. Sir Michael Peet did not present a legal brief or a divorce proposal. He laid a single page from the Operation Ironclad files on the table between them. The document showed that a young junior officer under Andrew's command had flagged a suspicious vehicle on the perimeter of Hyde Park 3 days before the bombing. But the warning had been buried in the administrative paperwork at the barracks. As the commanding officer, the final legal responsibility for that administrative failure rested squarely on Andrew Parker Bowles. Sir Michael Peet looked across the table and explained, with the calm precision of a surgeon, that if the public ever discovered the regiment had received a warning and failed to act, the reputations of the dead men would be tarnished, and the regiment itself could face a devastating public inquiry. The threat was clear, precise, and entirely deniable. Buckingham Palace was threatening to rewrite the history of the Hyde Park bombing to make Andrew look negligent, destroying his military legacy and the honor of the Blues and Royals in one stroke. Andrew Parker Bowles knew the administrative backlog had been caused by a government-ordered staff shortage, not by his own negligence. But he also knew that the British tabloid press would print the headline without ever examining the complex details of military logistics. Nuance does not sell newspapers. Blame does. The palace had found his absolute breaking point. He could survive the loss of his wife. He could survive the loss of his home. He could endure the public humiliation, the whispers at dinner parties, the sideways glances from men he had served beside in combat. But he could not, under any circumstances, allow the memory of his fallen soldiers to be dragged into a public relations war over a royal marriage. Those 4 dead men and 7 dead horses were sacred ground. The palace knew it, and they exploited it without mercy. He left the club and walked through Green Park toward his quarters. He did not call his lawyers. He did not seek counsel from his friends. He understood with absolute clarity that the system had trapped him using his own loyalty as bait. If he cooperated with the quiet divorce timeline, the duplicate copy of Operation Ironclad would remain in a secure basement, untouched and unread by the public. If he resisted, those files would find their way to a Sunday tabloid via an anonymous leak from a government department. The palace had weaponized a national tragedy to secure a domestic resolution. But here is where Andrew Parker Bowles' decades of military training kicked in and produced a countermove the palace strategist never anticipated. As he compiled his personal papers for his final retirement from the army in 1994, he discovered an error made by the palace courtiers. Sir Michael Peet had left a photocopy of the Operation Ironclad extract on the table at the Cavalry and Guards Club, and Andrew had slipped it into his pocket. On the reverse side of that page was a digital timestamp showing it had been printed from a computer terminal inside the cabinet office on the very same morning Charles had approved his upcoming television confession. The two operations, the intimidation campaign and the media strategy, were linked by the same digital footprint. Andrew locked the time-stamped photocopy inside his secure locker at the Household Cavalry headquarters. He had no intention of using it to threaten the future king, but it served as his insurance policy. The state had proven it was willing to use the bodies of his soldiers to protect the reputation of the Prince of Wales, shattering every principle of military honor in the process. He accepted the silence to protect his men, but the physical existence of that timestamp meant Buckingham Palace could never completely exhale. They had forced him into a corner, but they had left behind a paper trail proving that the crown's victory was achieved through cold-blooded institutional coercion, not a simple marital breakdown. Now, I want you to hold all of that in your mind. The surveillance, the financial starvation, the weaponization of the Hyde Park bombing, because what happens next looks on the surface like a completely innocent event, a wedding. And the way the media covered it was almost insulting in its simplicity. February of 1996, Andrew Parker Bowles stands at the altar of the Chelsea Register office wearing a plain gray suit instead of his military uniform. Rosemary Pittman stands beside him, holding a small bouquet of winter flowers. There are no royal photographers outside, no crowds on the pavement. The marriage registry shows only a handful of close friends signed as witnesses. This quiet ceremony took place exactly 1 year after his divorce from Camilla became final. The media framed it as a quick rebound. A simple story of an aging bachelor finding companionship after a public marital collapse. But the timing of this wedding was not an accident of romance. It was the execution of a binding family arrangement. In October of 1995, Andrew Parker Bowles had sat down for lunch at the Turf Club with Mark Shand, Camilla's brother. Mark did not come to discuss family gossip. He delivered a specific message from Highgrove House. The Prince of Wales wanted assurance that Andrew's upcoming marriage to Rosemary would not trigger a fresh wave of media interest in the past. Charles needed Andrew safely settled into a new, quiet life before the palace could begin the long, delicate process of introducing Camilla as his official partner to the British public. The arrangement centered on the future of Andrew's children. Tom was 21, Laura was 17. Both were entering the age where their social standing could be easily destroyed by palace politics. Mark Shand made it clear that if Andrew remained a bitter, single, divorced man, the press would continue using him as a weapon to attack Charles and Camilla. But if Andrew remarried quietly, the story would die, and his children would be rewarded with direct access to the prince's inner circle. Charles was offering to fund Tom's university education and secure Laura a prestigious position in the London art world. The price for their future was Andrew's public display of contentment. Andrew Parker Bowles accepted the terms at the Turf Club table. He chose to appear happy for the sake of his children's careers. The strategy worked exactly as the palace planners intended. Tom Parker Bowles eventually became a successful food writer, frequently supported by royal connections. Charles became his godfather. Laura grew up to manage significant art galleries in London, her social circle fully shielded from the fallout of her parents' divorce. Andrew had traded his own public reputation to purchase a normal life for his children, ensuring they would never be frozen out of the world they were born into. But the most profound secret behind Andrew's compliance, the one that reframes this entire 30-year saga, lay hidden in a medical file at King Edward VII Hospital. In November of 1994, just weeks before the divorce papers were drafted, Andrew Parker Bowles had undergone a routine military physical examination. The doctors discovered a severe cardiovascular anomaly that required immediate, high-risk surgical intervention. The medical records indicated that his long-term prognosis was highly uncertain. Doctors predicted he might not survive to see the year 2000. Andrew kept the diagnosis entirely hidden from his fellow officers and from the public. This medical reality transformed his entire calculation regarding the divorce. He realized that if he died while still legally married to Camilla, she would inherit his modest military pension and a mountain of unresolved debt from the Middlewick House estate. She would be left financially exposed and socially stranded, trapped in an ambiguous relationship with a prince who, at that time, could not marry a divorced woman under Church of England law. Andrew Parker Bowles did not step aside because he had stopped caring about his family. He stepped aside because he believed he was dying. He wanted to clear the path so that Charles would be forced to take full financial responsibility for Camilla's future. That single fact reframes the entire narrative. He was not the complacent husband who simply gave up. He was a man who received a terminal diagnosis and made a calculated decision to secure his family's future before his own body failed him. Andrew survived the surgery. He beat the medical predictions that had driven his choices in 1994. He lived to see the dawn of the new millennium. And he lived to attend the wedding of Charles and Camilla at the Windsor Guildhall in 2005. He sat in the pews as a guest, watching the woman who once shared his name take her place next to the future King of England. The reporters covering the event noted his presence as a sign of modern aristocratic maturity. A civilized resolution to an old scandal. They did not know that his presence was the final checkmark on a decade-old palace contract. He watched the ceremony knowing he had successfully delivered everyone to their designated destinations. His children were secure, his former wife was protected by the wealth of the Duchy of Cornwall, and his own medical file remained a secret locked away from public view. But as the wedding guests moved toward the reception at Windsor Castle, Andrew Parker Bowles walked back to his car alone. He had fulfilled every clause of the unwritten agreement, and the true mystery of his survival was about to take a different turn. He had outlived the diagnosis that forced his hand, but the palace machine had one final, unexpected role for him to play. Late 2025, Andrew Parker Bowles stands in the marble hallway of Westminster Abbey during a state event. He adjusts the medals on his chest, the honors from military service in Rhodesia and Northern Ireland catching the light. Television cameras sweep past his position, panning quickly toward the center aisle where Queen Camilla walks alongside King Charles III. Presenters broadcast live commentary to millions of homes, tracking every jewel in the crown and every senior royal in the procession. Andrew remains on the edge of the red carpet, a face in the crowd of dignitaries, entirely unacknowledged by the lens that once followed his family's every move. The official protocol records from the Lord Chamberlain's office show his exact placement at these major state events. He is consistently listed on the guest registers, but his seat is always positioned several rows behind the working members of the royal family. He receives the standard formal invitations appropriate to his rank as a retired brigadier and his historical ties to the court. However, the palace seating plans are constructed with mathematical precision to prevent him from appearing in the same television frame as the Queen. The institution keeps him close enough to monitor, but far enough away to maintain the barrier between Camilla's past and her present. This physical distance became starkly visible during a private reception at St. James's Palace in early 2026. Andrew attended as a former commander of the Household Cavalry, sitting at a round table with senior military staff. During the event, Camilla entered the room to greet the guests, moving table by table with her private secretary. When she reached the military section, her staff smoothly redirected her path toward the foreign attaches, bypassing Andrew's chair by a distance of several yards. The movement was seamless, practiced, entirely unnoticed by the other guests in the room. The separation reveals the final, ongoing condition of his agreement with the crown. Andrew Parker Bowles survived his 1994 heart surgery. He outlived his second wife, Rosemary, who passed away in 2010. He now lives a largely solitary life in his Wiltshire village. He watches his children, Tom and Laura, attend high-profile palace dinners as the stepchildren of the king, while he remains behind his locked gates. He has kept every promise he made to the Grey Men in 1995. He has never published a memoir. He has never sold a quote to a journalist. He has never corrected the tabloid stories that branded him a failure. But the true mystery of his current position lies in a small blue identity card issued by the Royal Parks Administration. The card grants Andrew Parker Bowles unrestricted personal access to the private grounds of Hyde Park Barracks at any hour, day or night. This privilege is rarely extended to retired officers who have been out of active command for more than 3 decades. It is not a social courtesy. It is not a standard pension benefit. The security logs at the barracks gate show that Andrew uses this pass at least once a month. He always arrives after dark, when the horses are settled in their stalls. He walks through the stables, speaking quietly with the young troopers, checking the tack rooms. The palace security team continues to log his entry and exit times with forensic precision, tracking his movements through the military compound via the closed-circuit television network. They know he is not there to cause a disturbance or leak information to the press. He is returning to the only place where his name still carries its original weight, far away from the corporate machinery that stripped him of his home, his marriage, and his history to protect the stability of the British throne. So let me close every door I opened at the start of this. Why did Andrew Parker Bowles walk away? Not because he was weak, not because he was bought. He walked away because the institution weaponized a 1982 bombing, surveilled his home, starved him financially, and then threatened the futures of his children. And underneath all of that, he believed he was dying. He chose a lifetime of quiet dignity over a multi-million-pound media war because he calculated, as any good officer would, that the cost of fighting was higher than the cost of surrender. What was in the leather-bound journal? Timelines, dates, names of gray men, surveillance records, receipts. The digital timestamp linking the Operation Ironclad intimidation campaign to the televised confession, and the medical file that proves his decision was shaped not by indifference, but by a heart condition that doctors said would kill him before the century turned. And that moment at the badminton horse trials in May of 1991, that 3-minute whispered conversation with Princess Diana, that was the moment Andrew Parker Bowles understood he was not dealing with a family dispute. He was dealing with an institution that had already classified both him and Diana as expendable assets. 2 people standing in the rain, soaked to the skin, being told by a woman who would herself die 6 years later that the palace had already decided their fates. Andrew Parker Bowles gave up his home, his career, his financial security, and his reputation to protect his children, his fallen soldiers, and the stability of the British crown. He chose silence. And at 86 years old, with that leather-bound journal finally open on the desk in front of him, the deepest secrets of the monarchy are still carried by the man who stands just outside the frame. Walking through the stables after dark, checking on the horses, keeping every promise he made to an institution that asked him to become the villain so the crown could survive. The question that lingers is not why he walked away. The question is how a man carries a secret like that for 40 years, knowing the truth was always sitting in a locked journal, waiting for the moment when the full story could finally be told. And now you know what was in that journal. The question is whether anyone at Buckingham Palace is ready for the rest of the world to know it too.